All right, can everybody hear me? It is 1:45, so I think we'll get started. This is the Ping Identity Masterclass. This is the first of 3 50-minute sessions. There'll be a 10-minute break in between each session, and then I think it wraps up around 4:35. In this first session, we're talking about Ping Identity and modern identity and access management. We're going to split this up between myself and my colleague Jim here. I'm going to be giving a presentation covering a few different topics, and then Jim will be getting into a demonstration in more finer or lower level details. So we're going to start a little bit broad and then kind of narrow our way down into specifics as we go. So I'll talk about market trends, more general market trends in the industry. I'm going to give a quick overview of OAuth features in PingFederates. There's probably some PingFederate customers out there, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Then I'm going to talk about a use case that I think is pretty interesting in the financial industry. Talk about new features that we added to PingFederate 8.4, which was just released last week. And then, like I said, we'll transition over to Jim. Just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Fazendin. I'm a product manager at Ping Identity. I've been with the company since 2005. So I've seen a lot of growth in the company, a lot of growth in this conference over the years. It's been it's been a great experience. But I product manage PingFederates, and in general, I'm always very interested in understanding how organizations are using federated single sign-on authentication, authorization, any of those things. So if you have a topic you want to discuss after the session here, I'd be more than happy to chat with you. All right, so like I said, we're going to start off with some broader topics. So there's a number of items here I'm going to go through. This first one I think should be pretty obvious to most people here, but I think it's also still worth emphasizing just because it's continually evolving. But authentication continues to shift away from applications. Federated SSO using SAML has been a clear example of sort of the benefits of this type of design. SaaS vendors have been able to reduce their risk by controlling the proliferation of passwords that they have to deal with. Large organizations have been able to, or larger organizations who deployed heavier WAM stacks in years past have been doing this for a long time as well. But the market now has a lot of more lightweight, more modern authentication services, and that's allowing for even the smaller organizations to adopt this model internally for their applications. So the smaller organizations see the value of centralizing authentication and integrating their applications with that service. And there's clear benefits to this in terms of reducing risk, increasing security, increasing the end user experience. Organizations can provide their developers an SSO integration pattern while allowing their developers to then focus on sort of the business logic of the application. Loosely coupled components based on standards. What was I going to say here? I think, so some organizations are going to prefer a stack approach provided by a single vendor, but I think there's a trend and sort of a preference towards loosely coupled architectures where organizations can pick best of breed components for their solution. And simplicity and loosely coupled components that integrate using standardized protocols make this happen. Organizations have the flexibility to independently manage, upgrade, swap out the components in their environment without having to make a heavy lift across the infrastructure or to upgrade everything just to get that one new feature. There's also a lot of focus in the market beyond just the end user, in the IAM space at least. There's also administrators, there's developers, there's help desk personnel. Administrators should have access to potentially the entire IAM solution or individual components that they're responsible for. Developers should be able to administer how their applications are integrated into the IAM solution. Help desk personnel should be able to find users, look up users, edit users, etc. All this requires the right entitlements, not only for sort of the end user focus, but for all the other more administrative aspects of the IAM solution. probably heard quite a bit about intelligence this week. It seems to be a very popular topic. I think of intelligence as really coming down to three things, at least intelligence in terms of identity. There is the static or the registered identity, how the user, what the user identity in the directory is, what their attributes are. The historical perspective, how has this identity been used over the years? And contextually, what is the identity being used for at this moment? And further, not just this identity, but potentially all the identities in the system, what's going on contextually, what IP address is the user coming from, what time of day is it, what application, what resource is the user trying to access. In support of all of those trends, there's been a clear bias towards OAuth and OpenID Connect, at least for new deployments. Federated SSO using SAML. SAML is still the leading federated SSO protocol, but new deployments are deploying with OAuth and OpenID Connect. And for good reason. There's a lot of additional capabilities of OAuth over SAML. It is the protocol to use to enable mobile applications, to enable JavaScript applications or SPAs. And then OpenID Connect is being used for cross-domain single sign-on, but also due to its simplicity, we're seeing a lot of customers integrate OpenID Connect directly into the application as sort of that last mile integration. So with that, I'm going to transition over to PingFederate, and I have sort of a laundry list of features here I'm just going to run through in terms of what PingFederate supports for OAuth. So it's an OAuth 2.0 authorization server and an OpenID Connect provider. Actually, I should have put, and also a relying party. We support a number of grant types, the code, the implicit, refresh, password, client credentials. We support a SAML authorization grant. And then in PingFederate 8.4, again, which just released last week, we support a JOT authorization grant as well. And we'll talk about that some more here in a little bit. We also support a couple of different types of access tokens. So we have refresh tokens, we have reference style tokens, which is a reference to the access token data stored on PingFederate. The reference itself contains no data. But then we also support JOT access tokens as well that optionally are either signed or encrypted. This allows for resource servers to be able to potentially validate that JOT without having to call back to PingFederate's introspection endpoint. We also support token introspection to allow for that if needed. We support a number of different ways clients can authenticate to PingFederate, ID and secret. We've also, for a while, have supported a mutual TLS form of authentication, where the client can do client certificate auth. And then in 8.4, we also added support for JOT-based client authentication, and we'll come back to that as well. Support PXE. PXE is a approach to mitigate the risk of primarily for malicious apps that are attempting to steal authorization codes. So PXE addresses that problem. We also support OpenID Connect Discovery, which is a way for relying parties to very easily and in a standardized way get the metadata about OpenID Connect providers just to ease the onboarding. Support a number of different ways to manage clients. We have an administrative UI as well as a couple of different APIs for managing clients. Grant management. Users are able to self-service, review the grants that they've issued to clients, and potentially revoke those grants if they, for example, lose their phone with the mobile app that they once authorized. Support scopes. There's a number of different policies that we support. Just a couple of key items here is lifetimes. You can configure unique lifetimes for refresh tokens and access tokens, and those can be unique per client, potentially. They can be global as well. And then we also support the ability to bypass the authorization step. So if you have apps that you're integrating with OAuth in a corporate environment or in some way where you trust the client, you have a sort of pre-established trust with that client, you may choose to not bother your users with the authorization prompt that they're normally accustomed to with more social or consumer-facing type applications. And then the last item here is a little plug for, we have an OAuth Playground, so not a part of PingFederate, but in addition to it. And this is a great tool if you would like to learn more about OAuth or learn more about how PingFederate supports OAuth. The Playground's a great tool for this. It's very simple to deploy, and you basically copy in a couple of files, and it'll configure PingFederate with a number of different OAuth use cases. And then it's got a UI that'll walk you through kind of what's happening through those. All right. So I do want to talk about a particular use case that I think is interesting, taking place in EMEA and in the United Kingdom. They are working on establishing new open APIs that allow for financial transactions to be conducted online. And these are known as open banking and PSD2. PSD2 covers the broader of Europe. Open banking is really focused in the United Kingdom. PSD2 also happens to be a little bit more open to interpretation, whereas open banking is working towards actually defining specific standards that organizations can adopt to interoperate with other organizations that support open banking. So in this particular segment, I'm just going to be talking about open banking due to how it's working towards actual specifications. So open banking is a requirement for, there's nine identified banks today that need to adopt this new regulation or meet this regulation by January of 2018. And then from there, I think it'll be expanded to other banks, but January is sort of the first milestone. And also just to mention, open banking covers many, many things. In this little segment here, I'm only going to be covering one particular aspect of it. So amazingly, if you think about it, online commerce really has not evolved over the years. You go out to a site, you want to purchase a product, you add it to your cart, you check out, and you hand over to the site this essentially a bearer token that has this purchasing power authority against your credit. And there's no real reassurance to you as the consumer that nothing bad's going to happen with that data after you've submitted it. So you don't know if that site will, or the people behind it will intentionally or unintentionally use your data, your credit card information in malicious ways. But open banking is working to address that. Like I said, they are working towards defining a set of standards to secure and really innovate and improve on these types of consumer transactions, financial transactions online. So let me walk through what it might look like, or what it will look like, I should say. So let's say your 6-year-old comes home from school one day and demands that to survive another day at school, they must have one of these. I know my son lost one once, and it was the most devastating thing that happened to him. Anyway, so you go out to the site, you add it to your cart, you check out, and this is that point that we're all very accustomed to. You submit your credit card information. Hopefully nothing bad happens, cross your fingers, and you complete the transaction. But here's the point where open banking is going to really kind of change that experience. So instead of submitting your credit card information, you would identify the bank that you use. And so we'll select your bank. You'll click the checkout button or the authenticate button, whatever, obviously. But this will initiate a transaction with your bank so that your bank can actually prompt you and say, do you really want to make this purchase? So I think this is great. So users no longer would have to supply a merchant, this powerful token against their credit, and they can be redirected to their bank and actually approve it. So to describe sort of how that's going to happen, open banking is going to leverage an aspect of the OpenID Connect specification called the request parameter. The request parameter is a way to send signed data from the relying party to the provider, which therefore will allow for communicating things in a more secure fashion then traditionally the OpenID Connect authentication request includes a number of query parameters that, and there's no real security provided around that. So you can't, you can really only communicate things that can't be manipulated or used in sort of bad ways. And this is to show you what it's going to look like. I was a little worried about how small that font would be, but hopefully you can see it. At the very top is an authentication request URL to an OpenID Connect provider. The part highlighted in green is this new request parameter that's going to be included. And I abbreviated the value of that, but that would be a JOT, encoded JOT. The body of the slide here is the data payload of that JOT. So you can see that it's being issued to or audience to your bank, the redirect back to the merchant, and then in the kind of lower section here, in this claim section is where the actual data is going to be communicated from the merchant to the bank that describes the transaction that this particular user is attempting to conduct. Now in this particular case, what I think open banking is headed towards is referencing an identifier of the transaction. Therefore, before this step, the merchant would call an open banking specific API to sort of bootstrap this transaction to say, I have a user, they want to purchase something, and therefore they want to transfer this amount of funds into over to their account. So we've added support for this request parameter, the signed JOT, in PingFederer 8.4 as both an OpenID Connect provider as well as a relying party. So PingFederate, you can configure it to require that a particular client or RP is required to send this request parameter as a signed JOT. And then as a relying party, PingFederate can be configured to send the request parameter as a signed JOT. I've just got a couple more slides related to PingFederate 8.4 features I'm going to talk about. Then we're going to transition over to Jim, who will get into more details on these as well as the demonstration. So in 8.4, we've also added support for the JOT Authorization Grant. And this is to support scenarios where there needs to be, there's an API that needs to be called, and it requires an access token. But this access token needs to be issued or in the context of a particular subject. But it's more of a client or a server-to-server type call, and the user isn't present in the transaction. So this could be like a scheduled event where API calls are being made out to, say, a SaaS vendor's API. Again, needs to be in the context of a user, but it happens on a scheduled cadence, and the user's not there to authorize particular transactions. So we've added support for that. Also, to help with that, we've added support for calling PingFederate to issue the JOT specifically for that authorization grant. So we do this on top of our WS Trust support. We've done something similar in the past with a SAML token to be used in the same way. But with this support, you can call PingFederate, exchange some sort of local token that would represent the user identity for this JOT that again represents this user identity that then can be passed over to the authorization server. And this could be done over kind of federated scenarios. And then also in PingFederate, you can sort of piggyback off of some existing federation trust that you already have for this particular configuration and add to that. Last thing I'm going to mention here, and I brought this up a few slides ago, we also added support for JOT client authentication. So that the client can authenticate to the authorization server, to PingFederate's token endpoint using a JOT. As I mentioned, we've supported ID and secret and mutual TLS previously, but the benefit of this now is that it's a way to do public-private key-based authentication, therefore not having to share the symmetric key of the secret in an ID secret sort of form of authentication with multiple servers. The private key in this case never has to leave the client. The client just needs to share the public key with the authorization server or potentially publish that in some way. PingFederate can call a JWKS URI to retrieve it. And it also doesn't have the sort of complexity that certificate management, certificate trust would require for mutual TLS. All right, that's my part. Jim's going to take over.
Thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim. I'm Jamshid Khosravian. I go by Jim. I'm a senior software developer at Ping. I'm a Canadian, and I'm a part-time dodgeball player. What we're going to go through today is talk about some of the features that Eric talked about and do some configuration highlights, talk about the demos that I'm going to present here and go through the demos, and then end it with, I hope, what's going to be about at least 10 minutes of Q&A for you guys to talk through these things. What are the features? We're going to go through the JOT Authorization Grant, JOT OAuth to client credentials, and OpenID Connect request objects. Each one of these are part of a spec, and I'll talk about the details of, a little bit about the details of the spec here and what we've done in PingFederate. So the first thing that we want to start with is the JOT Authorization Grant. This is something that you can use to grant access from the first security domain to the second security domain and make an API call to different API endpoints. This uses a single cross-domain JOT assertion. It must contain, that JOT assertion must contain an issuer, subject, audience, and expiry, and there are other things that can be included in the JOT, and the authorization server, the second security domain authorization server can make use of. The request should have a JOT bearer grant type, and it should include this JOT object. As Eric mentions, we do support a way to produce this JOT through PingFederate SDS, and I'll talk about that in a little bit and do a demo. The second feature that we're going to talk about is client authentication. This again uses a JOT bearer token. For client authentication, as a detail, the client ID should be part of that JOT and should be in the subject. When you make the request to the token endpoint, you need to use the JOT bearer for the client assertion type, and also use that JOT in client assertion value. These are HTTP parameters that will be part of the post payload going to the token endpoint of the authorization server. What this buys you is that because this is an asymmetric key, the private key never leaves the client. That gives you good security, and the authorization server only requires the public key portion of the key pair that client uses to verify the request and make sure that it's the client, it is signed with the right key, and it's a valid token. And for the third feature, it's going to be OpenID Connect request objects. This is request objects, a JOT request objects containing the scopes, response type, client ID, response mode, grants, and so on. The main benefits here is that it's a single and safe self-contained parameter. Within the request, there are requirements that you have to make, like you have to specify an OpenID scope as part of the auth request that goes to the OP. That's per spec, but other than that, everything is self-contained into one JOT token. And it is integrity protected if the JOT is signed. The OP can verify the signature and make sure that this was actually, the request was issued by the RP that is known, by the client that's known. So I'm going to go through some configuration how-tos. I hope, how many people administrate PingFed here? Okay. So it's going to be familiar. How many people deploy OAuth or OpenID Connect in their organizations? Okay, that's good. So it's going to be familiar. It's just a few extra options that we added to the clients page and the OpenID Connect relying party configuration. So the first let's talk about the client authorization configuration. This is a screenshot of the client management page. What we added here is that a way to enable JOT client auths. So you have, right now you'll have 4 options. You'll have none, password, or a client secret, client TLS certification, or JOT client, private key JOT. And then there is a replay prevention, so it'll prevent the client from reusing the same token for a client authorization. And at the bottom, there's the JWKS URL and JWKS. There are 2 different ways that you can specify the public key that correlates to this JOT private key. One is through the JWKS URL. The second one is you actually can copy and paste or use an API to import this configuration here. So for the OID Design Requests, we do provide the signed request. To enable the signed request, there's going to be I'm going to demo this. This is going to be right in the middle of the configuration flow, but you can enable the signed request and select the algorithm that you want to use for signing in the OpenID Connect provider information page. And also here, you can actually make use of the JOT client auth on your OpenID Connect RP connections, and that's basically, you have the 3 options. Private key JOT is one of them, and you can select the algorithm that you want to use to sign the JOT token that will be used as the client credential. And last, it's going to be JOT Authorization Grant type. Please take a look at the OAuth Playground. There are just too many steps here. And if you don't know where that is, it's a hiking trail in Vancouver that has about 3,000 steps going high. Actually, there's going to be a live demo of pretty much all of these. And it's live, so we'll see how it goes. But what am I going to demo? The first demo is going to be JOT Authorization Grant. I'm going to use 1 client, 2 PingFederate instances, 1 Ping Access instance, and some other stuff, some other components. There are different components. I just want to do a token exchange to PingFederate, get a JOT token, use that JOT token to get a local JOT token for domain B using the authorization grant and do the validation through Ping Access. A lot of things happen there, and I'm going to describe the whole thing after this. And then hopefully I can do a quick run of setting up an OpenID Connect relying party connection using JOT client auth and signed requests in PingFed if the connection stands. So this is going to be the demo one. We have a client. It's an Android client. I'm a Java developer, but I'm not an Android developer, so it's not going to look good, but it's going to do what it's supposed to do. I'm going to go through each piece one by one. The first thing that's going to happen is the client's going to make an authorization request to PingFed1. It's an OpenID Connect request, and it receives an access token and an ID token. Now that the client has an access token and an ID token, it's going to make a REST request call to the token exchange layer that I built. This is a little Java app that actually interacts with two PingFederate servers. And when the result of this call is going to be an access token that can be verified and used against PingFederer 2 authorization server. So what happens here is that when this token exchange layer receives an access token, it'll make an STS call to the PingFederate 1 using the OAuth token processor that we provide out of the box. So you have an access token, and you want to use that as part of an STS flow. The OAuth token processor understands your binary OAuth token, validates it, extracts the attributes in, and generates a JOT for you. And then we use that JOT to make a JOT authorization grant type to token endpoint on PingFederer 2 and receive a local access token that can be used on behalf of the user against the services that are protected with that token that connect to PingFederer 2. And when the client gets that token, it'll make a REST call to the PA01, and it expects a 200 OK with the payload coming back. What happens there is PA will make a token inspection call with that local access token to PF2. If it's valid, it'll forward the REST request to an API endpoint, basically reverse proxies it, and add some headers to the request, and the result comes back to the client. So again, this is a complicated flow. I added the first slide again here. And what step 1 and step 2 is a mobile client request to PF1, getting a access token and an ID token. The client then makes a request to exchange that access token for another access token using the JOT authorization grant, and then use that access token to make a call to ping access that proxies a request to an API endpoint. With that, okay, it's time for a demo. So this is the client. I know it doesn't look good, but we'll see. We're making an authorization request to PingFederate, and we're logging in here. And as pretty much all PingFederate admins should know, the password is 2Federate. So this is the consent form, and we accept the consent. This flow actually uses the Chrome custom tabs. If this is the pattern that has become one of the best practices for mobile development and OAuth and OpenID Connect. And it's really simple to use it, at least for Android. For iOS, it's a little bit harder to use. We allow that. I receive the subject and the access token. Now I'm going to make a token exchange call. And this is the local token that was issued on PingFederer 2. And then lastly, I'll make the API call. It should pop up, and it has the authorization header. This is basically an echo of the headers that were received on the API endpoint. That I was protected API endpoint has the header. It has a username that I put there, and yeah, it's through the Android. So this was fairly quick, and let's see if I can do the same thing with 2 PingFederer instances and get it going. So I'm using 2 PingFederer instances here as an authorization server and a relying party. And I hope I can do a 5-minute quick configuration for PingFed. I cheated a little bit. The certificates are trusted, so that helps out. But the way I'd like to do it is when I'm using two environments to set up a federation connection, I like to visit each environment only once. And this is my way. And this is going to be really simple and quick if I don't make a typo mistake here. I'm going to create OpenID Connect, IDP connection, or an RP connection here, and just go forward. What we have here is the issuer information, so if I make this right, it would be great. This is the issuer information of my first PingFederate or the OpenID Connect provider. Typo. Let's see how it works. So what this does is fetches the metadata endpoint based on the issuer and fills all the attributes that's required to set up these connections. As we go forward, you will see that all the token endpoint, the authorization endpoint, JWKS endpoint, user endpoint, all these stuff is already populated in the connection. So I'm just going to create a connection and a client. And this client doesn't exist, so I'm going to create this after the connection is created on the OP side. So this is the longest part. I'm just going to remove all the extended contracts. And by the way, these may be different based on the provider that you're using. If you're using Google, these are provided by Google's discovery document, and it's populated here. So I just want to get around the mapping. So now that we have everything mapped here, I will go to the protocol settings and I'll show you the settings that I talked about in the slides. So this is the OpenID provider information. It has the scopes already populated, authorization endpoint, the type of login that you want to use. It says that there's no client secret here, and it's right. I didn't set up client secret on the first page, but when I switch to use private key jot, it goes away because it doesn't need a client secret anymore. And then I will use a signed request object here and go ahead. Just a target endpoint. Oh. Should do the trick. Next. Done. Done. Next. And activate. Before saving, I would like to copy this redirect URL that's going to be used on my client configuration. And save. Going to the OP PingFederate, I'll just create a client. I'll name it client as I did previously. I'll select private key jot. Actually enforce signed requests and put in https:// That's the JWSKS endpoint that will be used to verify the request object signature and the private key jot signature. And put in the redirect URL and save. Oh. Do require authorization code grant. So now it's time to cross our fingers.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
Do you need to save the connection there? I think you need to save that one.
No, I will do it, but you don't need to. When you go to the main page, it's saved. OpenID Connect and start SSO. So you see the request object that Eric showed in his demo is up here with all the required attributes, and I am going to log in with Joe, and the user is toFederate, the password is toFederate, and log in. The consent form, and we are on the SP app with the subject Joe passed there through OpenID Connect, RP request object, sure. Request object and JOT client authentication. With that, I would like to go back here. Just want to mention that identifies coming this fall to the following cities and registration open. We would be happy to see you there. And now, thank you all, and it's time for question Q&A, and we have 5 minutes, so. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the demo. But my question more towards the first presenter. On the PingFederate new list of features, can you pinpoint which ones are added to 8.4? New ones.
So basically everything Jim talked about in sort of the last 3 kind of topics I covered in my deck are the new features for 8.4. There's the signed request object on the OpenID Connect authentication request, that signed request object. There's the JOT Authorization Grant, and then there's JOT Client Authentication. And then in support of the Authorization Grant, we have added support in our WS Trust for exchanging a local token for the proper JOT that can then be used for JOT Authorization Grants. So you got request object, JOT Authorization Grant, Client Authentication, and the JOT exchange with the STS.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Up here, Mark.
Thanks. Is there a way to restrict the grant that was given based on time or some other conditions?
Yeah, so PingFederate supports what we call issuance criteria, and we do this just about anywhere that PingFederate's going to issue some sort of token. So if it's an access token or if it's a SAML assertion for web SSO, anytime PingFederate's going to generate a token, we have a step that you can configure to look at different context, to look at time of day, to look at items in the request from the user's browser. So you can look at a lot of different factors there to determine whether or not to issue tokens. We didn't talk about it in the demo, but it's available on PingFederate. Anything else? All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.